concede that, but I do think that the biggest common denominator across all these things is kind of, and you can plot them on a graph, is society's declining health and the sports injury epidemic are both sort of resultant from living in this modern maladaptive environment. At least that's my, thesis anyway.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Hello, NeuFit Nation. Today we are going to talk about a very important topic, and that topic is energy. I would say the currency of life. And it's a fast follow on our last episode with Amy Myers, where we talked about functional medicine and some of the underlying factors that influence health, which of course itself underlies how effectively we can heal from injury, improve function if in cases of neurological injuries or neurodegenerative conditions, recover from surgery, and perform at our best, whatever that means to everyone listening here. And today we're going to go a layer deeper specifically on the energy component with my good friend Matt Cooper. So he's joining us. And just to tee up this episode, there's a few things that we're going to talk about here. Certainly in terms of energy, it's very important if we're trying to build muscle, recover from injury, really study hard for a test, or get through a full day of seeing patients or clients. We want to make sure we have energy on board. And when we talk about that, we're going to be talking about sources of energy, carbs and fat and things like that. And I've had to evolve a lot of my thinking just based on what I've learned and what I've experienced in my own, my own personal experiments and all that. So I'm excited to really dive in and talk about some of the details here. And part of the reason we're doing this is that Matt, he has been on the show before, by the way. You may recognize him from episode 47. If you haven't listened to that one yet, please go back. We talked a lot about biomechanics, fascial slings, and the concept of movement literacy. So he's a very, very skilled and effective trainer, performance coach. And he also has a deep knowledge of nutrition. And part of the reason we're having this conversation is that he just released his book, Adaptive Nutrition. But just to give you a sense of what's in it, the subtitle is A Biopsychosocial Approach to Improving Your Health, Performance, Fitness, Durability, and Quality of Life. So I think these are all things that everyone in the audience will be excited to hear about. Matt Cooper, welcome.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. Good to be back.
Yes. So I often, just for everyone's reference, I often refer to him as Coop, as do many other people. So if you hear me saying that, that's who I'm talking to. So Coop, you do a lot of work with athletes. You've been on this podcast before to talk about the exercise. We're switching here to talking about energy, and to sort of tee up this conversation. The introduction of your book talks about the injury epidemic, overall declining health in our society. Can you talk a little bit about those concepts to help frame up what it is we're really trying to achieve here with this conversation and the problem that we're really trying to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no secret to anyone who is either involved in the health field and or is a sports fan, but there's both a health and mental health epidemic going on in society. We have all these Neolithic diseases that that's a nerdy word for saying they didn't exist back in the day, type 2 diabetes, things like that. Obviously, there's an anxiety, mental health epidemic of various sorts, and then concurrently, we're also experiencing a big time epidemic with sports injuries, and that tends to get talked about in certain ways. Like in the NFL, you might have heard a debate, is it because there's a sensory mismatch with them playing on turf versus grass and things like that. And I'm sure to be fair, there are more factors than just this one. However, I don't think that that's the case, because you're seeing an injury epidemic across all sports, right? You're seeing it in the NFL. You're seeing it in the NBA. You're seeing it in pretty much all major sports. And, it is my belief that in spite of technology, things like the NeuFit coming out.
We're specifically talking about non-contact injuries, right? Of course, if there's contact injuries, that's one issue, but especially just to kind of highlight that point here, especially, non-contact injuries are just off the charts, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So with that being said, yeah, it's my belief that in spite of technology and improving things like the NeuFit, a lot of sports science technology, even our understanding evolving in some ways, while I do think maybe training can be improved, I think that by and large, one of the biggest differences between past generations where there were less injuries. Of course, a lot of these sports are being played at higher velocities, forces, things like that. Basketball being an example. However, a lot of guys, even when the game was more physical in other ways, were less hurt, and largely, I think those are one and the same with society's declining health. There's less time spent in natural lighting the sun, more time spent in front of blue light, right? There are less nutrients in our food. There are more ingredients in our food not meant for human consumption, more inflammatory agents, if you will. Kids in their physical development, recess can often become screen time versus playing and getting a robust variety of motor patterns, not to mention more time in the sun, right? People are just on their phones more, which can also create sensory mismatches and mess up things like dopamine, which can downstream affect how muscles fire and wire and timing. So there's a lot of different rabbit holes, as you can see, that we can get into with this. But the main, back of the book sort of explanation is that, we're sort of fish outside the fish tank, and we're living with this evolutionary mismatch. Our sleep cycles are disrupted. Food isn't necessarily the same compared to what it was before. And then from a physical development side, childhood is probably the most important thing. And so we're getting a less robust, portfolio of motor patterns, less sort of physical development from less playing multiple sports, over specializing. So a lot of these different things kind of coalesce into one. And like I said, there are other factors. Certainly, I concede that, but I do think that the biggest common denominator across all these things is kind of, and you can plot them on a graph, is society's declining health and the sports injury epidemic are both sort of resultant from living in this modern maladaptive environment. At least that's my, thesis anyway.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I'm inclined, not surprisingly, since I invited you on the show, inclined to agree with you on many of those concepts. Especially, well, a lot of it makes sense. I mean, light, the circadian biology is such a huge first domino for so many things. I mean, that can make a huge difference for neurotransmitters, for cognitive abilities, for stamina and strength output, recovery abilities, blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, protein synthesis. I mean, there's so many downstream things just from, the time you sleep and wake and when you view light and don't. I mean, that's a huge one. So that could be a whole other episode. I know today we're planning to talk more about biochemistry, nutrition, stuff like that. And of course, that is, one of the biggest levers to pull. But before we go there, I don't want to, especially the circadian biology piece of it, I want to make sure we don't undersell how important that is. So just highlighting
Yeah.
right there. But transitioning into the biochemistry topic, there's this concept of metabolism. People think, oh, I have a good metabolism, or oh, she's got a good metabolism or a bad metabolism or something like that. Can you just give us a working definition so that as we move forward, that kind of gives us a foundation or a jumping off point where we're speaking the same language?
Yeah, certainly. So metabolism refers to basically just how well your physiology is working. And essentially, there's two parts to it. Basically, both having enough energy being produced at the cellular level. Your mitochondria produces ATP, that is like the Bitcoin of the body, if you will. And that's what it costs to do things like thinking and speaking, like we are on this podcast, all the way to, muscle firing and wiring, maintaining hormonal manufacture and balance, immunological health and things like that. So it all requires energy. I think that's, in spite of being able to go in the weeds in certain areas, it's a pretty easy concept to understand. And also there's an efficiency to your metabolism too. So when generally when you're younger, you're more resilient to stressful inputs, whether that's being in college and having a little bit too much fun on the weekend and being able to bouncing back quicker from injuries, cuts, scars that may otherwise linger. Let's say if an elderly person gets them. And so the idea is when you have a more youthful metabolism or youthful resembling metabolism, you are pulling energy through the system faster. and you're better able to be more resilient to stress, and you're also better able to regenerate, right? There are some instances, for example, like I mentioned, injuries, even as bad as like, cutting off the slicing off part of your finger, something like that. And then cases of maybe a little less in this forthcoming generation, but cases of, kids being able to regenerate really fast, right? And regrow tissues that are much harder to come by when you're an adult. So I would say it's sort of the working definition is thinking how much gas you have in the tank, and then how many RPMs it's able to operate as, right? And I think where a lot of people go wrong is, the mainstream, I think, tends to go wrong from having a lot of red in their bank account, right? They're not sleeping well. They're, maybe not overtraining, but they're like overreaching in life. And collectively they're spending more than they put in, right? They're not getting enough green from the sun, sleep, diet, so on and so forth. And then I think even some of us well-intentioned people in the health community tend to go about that the wrong way too. We do diets like, survival state diets, whether it's keto, carnivore, plant-based, not trying to pick on anyone in particular, that actually kind of maybe, create a metabolic compensation similar to a compensation when you get injured in a movement pattern. And then that can create a slowed down metabolism, right? Which with less regenerative capabilities, potentially more degeneration, more stress physiology. And we do that sometimes inadvertently thinking we're doing something right.
There are many great things you said there. One that I really like, that term, you talked about having a youthful metabolism or youthful resembling metabolism. So, and that's right. We can improve it even at advanced age. And that's, the reason we're having this conversation is because if anyone listening to this is, thinking about energy and thinking, gosh, I wish I had more energy to recover faster between workouts or recover from this injury, or just to be able to be more vibrant and alive and alert during the day, and, be able to be present in my interactions instead of feeling like I'm kind of in a slump and having to really just make a lot of effort to pay attention. Like, I remember back when I was in high school and we had hockey practice really late at night, and I'd have to get up early for school, and I'd, fall asleep in class. It took effort just to stay awake. So if we're going through the day feeling like that, this conversation can also make a big difference. And, whether, sometimes it's athletic performance, sometimes it's just having energy during the day that can help it hit home.
Yeah. Big time. I mean, that's what I try to tell people is like, although the book was aimed at sports nutrition, as is, elements of this discussion, the principles of this really are there for all of us, right? Whether it's for, getting not just more years out of your life, but more life out of your years, for, athletic performance, durability, longevity, but also just that's what life is, right? We're not all born on the same starting line. Some of us are born on third base, other ones not, but in terms of our physiology and all that. But, I think some people listening to this can relate to the sense that they may have almost like extreme empathic qualities, in the sense that when they're maybe a stick in the bike spokes to their day happens, like someone comes in their workplace angry, someone cuts them off in traffic, the idea of changing up your routine, maybe for some people, the idea of talking to the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever it is, these things create this kind of like almost quicksand type reflexive stress response that even if we cognitively know these things aren't a big deal, we sort of like, they seem stressful. I remember at one point, before I kind of fixed my metabolism, the idea of just like going out and being social, like when I'd be in public around people, I would, and I wasn't always this way, I would have this sort of like, not social anxiety in like a overthinking necessarily way, but almost like this kind of like physiological knot that would occur. And I also, like you mentioned with hockey, I would sort of like feel like I didn't have enough, energy to get through my day, and then also kind of do, some of the more, fun aspects of life. I noticed I had less like of a creative stroke, less of a sense of humor for a few years when I was doing pretty hardcore fasting and keto. And then what's interesting is that when you start to really improve, your energetic capacity, your gas in the tank, and then also just your RPMs of your metabolism, the speed of your metabolism, what ends up happening is you like stressors like that tend, instead of kind of like shutting you down, tend to like bounce off your windshield like a bug off the windshield, right? And you're less sort of affected by them or paralyzed by them. So I think that's really powerful, because ultimately we're meant to take in the full breadth of life, including stressors like quitting your job and becoming an entrepreneur, uh, having fulfilling relationships, maybe moving to that town, all of these different rites of passage that require biological energy, right? And so I think the more we optimize our metabolism and our energy, it's not just like the fun stuff like body composition, athletic performance, things like that. It's also, I now have I'm more of an energetic gas tank to be able to bite off some of these beautiful stressors of life. Because ultimately, there's a quote that I love, and I think it's Dr. David Eagleman who says it. I'm sorry if I'm messing this up, but it's, your reality depends on what your biology is up to. So my physiology is going to depend ultimately how I both take in and show up in the world, right? And so I think that hopefully, there's all that just to say there's something everyone can pull from this conversation. And I really think it affects all of us, whether you're an athlete all the way to someone in a wheelchair.
Yeah, I'm really fired up about this conversation because it really just, hearing you talk about it now even reinforces it for me. But this is really the fundamental, the fundamental element that colors our whole experience of life. If we have enough energy or not to get through our day and be able to feel like we can expand, or feel like we're constantly contracting, or be able to take on those social interactions, or bracing and thinking, oh crap, I don't have the energy for it. So it's so important. And a couple of good things you said there are also a segue where several minutes ago you mentioned these survival state diets, like how keto or carnivore can sort of make the body feel like it's in a survival state. Can you talk to us about what that means? And also, I think in that conversation, see if we can touch on the differences between burning for oxidizing or using fat for fuel versus carbohydrates, and some of the differences there, because I think it'll naturally kind of connect.
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, I think most diets that are extreme, whether that's severe caloric deprivation, whether that's chronic fasting, whether that's, again, I'm not trying to be an ideologue here, so whether it's plant-based or some iteration of keto, low carb, carnivore, ultimately, most of those things plunge our physiology into something of a survival state. Some people might be able to get away with it more, right? For example, pro athletes, one of their superpowers for the most part is being able to overcome bad physiological inputs. We all know NBA players, NFL players who eat, kind of like a teenage video gamer, right? And yet they're still performing at this high level. So I think that their physiological resilience eventually does catch up to them, but probably not as bad and or takes longer than it would for your average person. But with these diets, I mean, it depends on which diet we're talking about, but usually a deficiency in a key nutrient, and or in the way we produce energy, like in the case of keto or fasting, can cause a survival state. Obviously, some diets are like what the mainstream does might be worse, and you're eating a ton of junk food and you're creating this hyper-inflammatory state. But there are, obviously rungs on the ladder, and I would rank some of these quote unquote health diets or even elimination diets as capable of putting us into a stressed physiology, and thus making us less adaptable to stressors of sport and life. As far as glucose metabolism and fat burning, you always are doing both. There's no such thing as doing one or the other. You have 37, I believe it's trillion cells in the body, and only certain cells are, only glucose dependent. For example, our retinal cells. So if vision is a thing, whether it's for health or performance, right? Like, you definitely don't want to be on a glucose-free diet. The other thing to think about here too is our physiology is adaptable, so your body can, let's say if it's your body's preferred fuel source is glucose, you can sort of retrain it to be more efficient at burning fat, but at the same time, that's kind of an inefficient state. So I'll unpack that a couple different ways. For one, and this is something everyone can agree on, even the biggest keto proponent, for which, that's a club I used to belong to, we all agree that it's a compensatory mechanism. And by that, I mean, the thesis is when you don't have, a readily, easily digestible energy source in the form of carbs, you break down fat, you break down, your own tissue, and then you mobilize that into energy, right? So everybody agrees on that. So I think the disagreement is that the keto folks would say that's an advantage. I would say it's the opposite, right? I'm going to say my body needs glucose so bad it's literally willing to cannibalize itself to get there, right? Because you're getting glucose either way. It's either just orally, or it's by breaking down your own tissue to get there. And so your body's gonna, you're never going to be completely glucose independent. And so I also think people should rethink that. Like, you're going to get glucose anyways. Why is it bad if it's coming through food? And why is it good if my body's manufacturing it itself, right? So I think that's something worth thinking about. I think some people do become inefficient at burning carbs, especially if they're eating a really poor quality of food, or doing, chronic extreme fasting or lower carb diets. And then they go and they add in carbs and like, oh, I don't feel good when I eat them. It's like, well, yeah, you've sort of retrained some of your metabolic machinery, insulin signaling, things like that, to where carbs could be problematic. So in that case, you could still switch back. It would probably just need to be a little bit more of like a carb reloading type concept. But yeah, anyways, all that just to say, the final thing there is that if you look at, most disease states, diabetes, things like that, there's actually a lot more fat utilization in those states, right? It's actually the opposite of what most people think. So why are we then trying to push and nudge our body into a state that resembles disease states with a lot of free fatty acids floating around in the blood? I think, the other thing people have to realize is that literally on premise, in order for your body to manufacture its own tissue into fat, it has to release a lot of stress hormones in that breakdown process. Things like glucagon, cortisol, various stress hormones, and those can be problematic for the body, for one. For two, it should, even intuitively, without getting too far into the weeds, this should make some sense, because if I don't have a readily available energy source, my body has to kind of inefficiently cannibalize itself to get there, right? That should, at some level, like the idea of mining for energy that hopefully would be there, readily available, that should send off some, red flags that this might not be an optimal state, and or might come with some type of biological consequence.
Mm-hmm. That I love that, because it's just sort of a common sense approach to say, and that's, I was also in that kind of low carb keto camp, sort of belief system, and thinking through and talking through with you, obviously, was a big influence that opened me up to some of these ideas. And I've seen the benefits also as I've changed some of my nutrition habits and strategies there. One interesting point is, even if people are on a carnivore diet or something like that, you talked about how they're going to go through these physiological processes to still create glucose. So even someone who hasn't taken in any carbs or extremely low carbs, their body's still going to do what it can to maintain a blood glucose level of about 70. And you can't really get much lower than that without, for a healthy person in a fasted state. Obviously, if someone's got, takes too much insulin and their diabetes, or absent issues like that. But so yeah, I think that's really good. And then another point there that you talked about how fasting is stressful. So I think it's instructive to think about fasting as a stressor, just the same as exercise or cold exposure, and they all can have value because they stress the body, and it creates some sort of hormesis type effect where the body can, become more adaptable in some way in response to that. But you also have a finite capacity to deal with stress. So you might not want to do all of them at the same time. You might not want to train for elite performance and do an extreme cold exposure and fast all in the same period of time. When Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days, he wasn't also Olympic lifting and doing a bodybuilding bulk routine, right? I mean, you got to kind of pick and choose. And so assuming if you were not, I guess there's a little bit of a question here. If you were not as concerned about, your athletic performance in that moment, do you think there are still health benefits to fasting, so long as it's sort of, you understand that that is your primary stressor during that time, and you're not trying to layer too many other things on top of it?
Yeah. I've never, the point of this conversation was never to kind of, turn people into a hypochondriac for things like that. I do think there is some merit to cold stress, although I think this chronic doing it every day recommendation is probably not appropriate for the modern maladaptive environment and people with an incredibly stressed physiology. I also think there's reasons why you don't want to do it after training too, but I would classify fasting like you did very well as training in a sense, right? Like it is a type of potentially hormetic stress, but the same way you're not going to overtrain, you're not going to, you don't want to overfast, right? So done on occasion as a hormetic stress, I think that there's something to that. And there's probably also something to the idea of the more green you have in your bank account, and the more these are all these little data points like inputs from sleep, X, Y, and Z, are these little flags. If enough of them are pointed in the right direction to where they're giving you more green in your bank account, you can probably afford a little bit more red in the right places. Maybe fasting a little more frequently, maybe more physical outputs for sport, right? That's kind of what I do with a lot of these teams I consult with. In the NBA, there's like load management is a big topic right now. It's like, all right, let's try to get as much green in the bank account for these guys, and then let's try to minimize as much unnecessary red, so that way they can quote unquote have more to spend, if you will, playing during the season, right? So I think anyone can kind of at different rungs on the ladder, from athlete all the way to someone dealing with some sort of metabolic disease state, they can apply that to themselves. Okay, so I should be doing all the things right now that make my physiology, my metabolism feel safe. There should, sugar, for example, is a signal of abundance, right? Not being in a chronically caloric restricted state is a sign of abundance. Having certain nutrients, right, is a sign of abundance. And so you want to send a lot of those even more of those signals, the more either someone is overreaching or spending, right, like an athlete, or the more like starting below the starting line someone is physiologically, right? Whether it's someone in like some deep neurodegenerative state, or some sort of like highly concerning kind of gut situation. So hopefully that kind of paints a picture that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's an excellent description. And if anyone else listening to this is like me, having these conversations many months ago, and you're starting to think, okay, maybe we shouldn't be demonizing carbs. Maybe there's value in them. This kind of makes sense biologically, evolutionarily, all these different things. Let me ask you one question that came to my mind. So if I think about having more carbs, the first kind of alarm bell that goes off in my mind is, well, what about controlling my blood sugar? I know there's hazards to having blood sugar that's too high for too long, and that of course is why diabetics have neuropathy and might have limbs cut off and stuff like that. So how do you think about controlling blood glucose and balancing carb intake, and how do you think about those dynamics?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think people who are going to feel the effects of high blood sugar are probably people who are not very physiologically robust in the first place. Think about like the one of the first answers I gave, where I said all these minor stresses are going to appear as larger stressors, whether that's perceptually, if we're talking about life stressors, or whether that's an insult to your physiology. Let's take gluten for example. I recommend people avoid that as much as possible, but it also shouldn't ruin your weekend if a little, unless you're a full-blown celiac, to which only 1 in 100 should be, right? But because of all this, the additional gluten in bread products, because of things like glyphosates and pesticides, that's probably why we're seeing this rise in gluten sensitivity. However, at the same time, if I get a little bit of cross-contamination in there and I'm not a full-blown celiac, maybe I should feel that. My body should get some feedback, like, don't do that, dude. But it shouldn't ruin my whole weekend, right? So that's another example of like something that maybe should be a minor kind of like, nudge in the right direction. Like, don't do that, go somewhere else. It like, you feel the effects of it a lot. So I'll qualify it. I'll qualify it first. And that's probably why you see people show up with different I don't do great with, I don't feel as good in parallel with some of these sort of like blood sugar dysregulation, things like that. So there is that. That being said, I think it kind of just depends on the food you pair it with, right? I think a really high carb meal without protein, I believe Dr. Ray Peat said that can increase serotonin, right? Which is not the happy hormone. I mean, it's a molecule, we do need it. I don't want to demonize it, but similar to what all the information coming out about SSRIs right now, high serotonin is not ideal. And then on the other side of that, if you're eating pure protein without carbs, then that can also spike your blood sugar too. People don't really realize. At the same time, it also can cause potentially could cause some stress hormone association release there, and causes some types of amino acid imbalances too, right? You're getting too much of certain ones, maybe not enough of others, like glycine.
That's a good way to sort of reframe that question there. So,
I like one last thing sorry to interrupt you. One last thing I forgot is that this is kind of where a lot of us in our first journey into the fitness or health industry, some advice that maybe we like let go of that we should have hung on to. And that's like, what do they tell you? Is like in the beginning, it's like eat protein with your carbs and like, eat that maybe multiple times per day. And a lot of us sort of threw that out and we're like, nah, I don't really need that. I just need to be more of a fat burner. When it turns out that even if some of the bro scientists can't really explain why, there is something to that, and blood sugar control is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, that depends on how robust your metabolism is, like you described, and also your activity levels. Someone who's more active is going to be able to, dispose of their glucose a lot more efficiently in their muscles and their liver, and cumulatively over time, insulin sensitivity, all that, all those same rules still apply, right? So
certainly, absolutely. That's why you can do nutrition periodization if you wanted to get a little more technical, and then kind of eat a higher carbohydrate load during times of stress, whether that's from training or otherwise.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. So that gives you more of the green to help counteract the red, right? To use
exactly.
That. Yeah. You've mentioned a lot here, and this is something that really lands for me, and I imagine will land for a lot of people listening to this show here as part of NeuFit Nation, where talking a lot about stress and stress hormones being released versus more parasympathetic states, how eating more carbs supports that. Is there any more to say on the autonomic effect of food?
Yeah. That's a great question. Obviously, there are certain foods, pretty much most people listening to this podcast will be well familiar with certain foods that can trigger an inflammatory response. Gluten, for example, polyunsaturated fatty acids. In fact, when you burn stored fats coming from industrial seed oils and things like that, it actually liberates more stress hormones too. There are inflammatory foods that can cause a stress response in your nervous system, dealing with that insult. But there's also ways to think about how you should eat that coincide with, nutritionally controlling your autonomic nervous system, to borrow, something I once read from Dr. Pat Davidson. And the idea there basically is that in the morning we are meant naturally to release cortisol, right? And it's part of the natural waking process. We maybe don't want to spike it in a variety of ways, but it is okay probably at that time to eat some carbs, unless we're training, probably not a ton, or as much at least as we eat later. That number is relative. But later in the day, when we're starting to dial it down for sleep, for example, a lot of people actually avoid carbs at night, but it's really the opposite. You probably should have maybe your most carb dense meal towards the evening, or one of them. And the reason for that is that insulin directly opposes cortisol in the system. And so you can actually kind of quiet a lot of the stress response and stress hormones through sugar and glucose. This should intuitively, again, make sense, even those who are not as scientifically inclined, and because you crave sweets and carbs when you're stressed, right? So at some level, we all know that, more of the wisdom of the body at play here, which, listening to your body is probably one of my big takeaways here. But at any rate, the idea there is that you'll help quiet down your nervous system and prep your body for sleep. If you're someone, because sleep is probably the time where you're most likely to go into a little bit more of a fat burning state, biased from lack of food intake. If you're someone who finds yourself waking up during the night or not having a great quality of sleep, a lot of times that's because your liver runs out of glycogen for some of the regenerative processes and just general maintenance of the body's physiology. When you're perpetually having that happen and it's a pattern, a way to, again, basically counteract that is to give your body some carbs and sugar before bed so the liver doesn't run out of that glycogen and that thus doesn't start releasing these stress hormones like cortisol that kind of keep you up and maybe in a state where you can't get back to sleep and or are overthinking. So that's one way to think about eating too. Obviously, like, quality, quantity, timing is probably the order of importance, but if there is probably a general thing with timing that matters more than others, I would say just probably biasing more carb intake, maybe closer to your workout and then closer to the evening time, right? I have a lot of my athletes or everyday people as well do some raw honey before bed. Depending on the person, what their physical goals are, they may have some fruit juice. A lot of them in an ideal state, if they can tolerate it right straight out of the gate, might do something like goat milk, raw milk, or if that's not possible, it may be a good quality, even pasteurized milk. So things like that to just kind of, provide calcium to the system, which will relax the system, and then also, glucose for that highly regenerative process or sleep.
That's good. A lot there that we can do to really affect the autonomic nervous system. And, as probably everyone listening here knows, that is so important for our health, for our recovery, energy. That's a big deal, and very, very well said there.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Newbie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
I would like to transition to an adjacent topic here that you write about, and I know we've talked and you know quite a bit about. So when we're talking about energy and hormones, one of the first things that comes to mind is certainly thyroid hormones. So can you talk to us about generally the effect of thyroid on energy, just a little bit of the basics in case people aren't aware of some of that physiology, and then we can get into different nutritional levers we can pull and how they impact thyroid function.
Yeah, certainly. So I think, in addition to your brain, your thyroid gland and your liver are probably the three, if there is such a thing, the three like main quarterbacks of the body. Usually if something goes wrong with them, there's not really any like amazing fallback mechanisms or compensatory mechanisms. And so you tend to see a lot of issues coincide with those, right? So some, I mentioned it before, but like Dr. Ray Peat or Danny Roddy would talk about how health researcher Danny Roddy, a lot of people like them, stress researcher Hans Selye, they talk about how, I don't know if you had to put a number on it, but let's say 99+% of people probably have subclinical hypothyroidism just from the negative inputs from the modern maladaptive environment. And that's sort of one of the, in addition to an energy insufficiency, that's one of the commonalities amongst most states of dis-ease and or poor performance, right? So you should just know that if we're talking thyroid specifically, it's one of the commonalities amongst pretty much all issues. And when I say subclinical, I also want to point out that a lot of people listening are going to be like, well, I got my TSH and T3 and T4 tested and they were, reasonable enough. I would just add that A, they may not be comparing you to the healthiest population. And then B, what subclinical hypothyroidism refers to is the fact that it's a thyroid issue that's not going to show up in most labs. You really have to have that check engine light nudge so far to like a big time problem or, Hashimoto's, something like that for it really to like show up in labs and manifest like that. A lot of times, other things like reverse T3, whole blood serotonin, cholesterol, like a a constellation of data points can more accurately represent a thyroid problem in addition to the traditional metrics, as can an easy home test everyone can do, which is temperature and pulse rate upon waking, and then about an hour after their first meal for a few days. And so, you would ideally want to be looking at, certain metrics there. And if someone falls, outside of those ranges, or depending on what happens pre and postprandial, aka pre and post eating, that can kind of be indicative of certain, it could be a nice proxy or check engine light on a depressed metabolism and sluggish thyroid. And believe it or not, although that sounds like too good and too easy to be true, it was actually the primary way that they tested for, academia tested for, metabolic health as an indicator of metabolic health and thyroid up until I believe it was around the 1960s. So the nice thing is that that's something everyone financially more or less has access to, and it's a great general check engine light, and you could use that if it shows poorly and a combination of your symptoms or performance issues to then maybe guide a little bit more direct lab work or testing after that, right? Because some of us might have, all disease states are a type of general energy or being injury prone, whatever. There's probably always this like general sense of an energy insufficiency. That's the one common denominator. However, how that manifests in you or me can be different depending on our own genetics, epigenetic inputs from, how we were, our parents treated themselves, right? And then how we've treated ourselves to this point in our life and how we have or haven't taken care of ourselves, right? An energy insufficiency to you could be something like a hormone imbalance, right? Or to some people, it could be like started slowly but surely deteriorating or degenerating tissue in the form of hair, skin, and nails. Other people, it could be an immunological thing. So it can manifest in a lot of different ways, but I think the nice thing that simplifies all this is that it's all an energy insufficiency. Before we get too far away from the original question, which was thyroid, I'll probably, kind of curtail the conversation there, but there are athletic implications too. In fact, I know that there, like the Achilles tendon reflex that test was actually an indicator of thyroid function too. So the pliability and the elasticity of muscles probably is also yoked to our thyroid. I know that it's associated with, just to give you some more athletic or injury context, because I know a lot of listeners are going to be rehabbing or interested in that. Bone mineral density and calcium is also connected to thyroid health. So when you see some of these bone breaks or people are kind of perpetually injury prone there, that's obviously could probably one of many things, but thyroid could be intertwined with that too.
That's great. Very well said. If anyone is curious, do you have the guidelines for trying to self-test for heart rate, temperature? If people are curious and want to try that at home?
Absolutely. So, caveat, this isn't medical advice, but, for educational purposes, if someone was to do this at home, I believe Dr. Ray Peat had said that usually populations with, about in the 60s and up for beats per minute tend to be on the healthier side. I think if you're someone who's more active or an athlete or even just in general, shooting higher like 70s, 80s is better. I think the idea of endurance training sort of moved us all in the wrong direction with our perceptions, and that, a lower heart rate's better, right? That's better for cardiovascular health because it means I've trained more cardiovascular health. It's actually not true. You can have a really robust cardiovascular system and a high pulse rate. The reason why it's associated with endurance training is because endurance training is mostly maladaptive. While I would always advocate doing what you love in life, a lot of times these people are following these kind of more extreme or low carb diets, or at the very least, even if they aren't, they're kind of perpetually overtrained, right? Because your endurance capacity can push you past the point of ideal biomechanics, or even maybe push you past an ideal stress load on the body. A lot of times those people are kind of very frail and overly skinny. They tend to have some noticeable physical degeneration too. I would say that certain sports, including, most heavy endurance training, is going to be maladaptive on the body. And thus you see that with the indicator of low pulse rate. Getting back to people doing this at home, temperature, I obviously you want to see that closer to like 98, 98.5, 98.6. Most people, like even you can only go so far in that strike zone right? Before it becomes problematic, or you have a fever, or hypothermia people talk about. So there's not going to be a ton of variance, but if you're perpetually lower than that number, it would be indicative of some type of subclinical, at least, hypothyroidism or depressed metabolism. Again, just to re-queue up timing, it would be upon waking for both those tests to start with, and then again after your first meal or after breakfast. I think some people, what's interesting is they kind of have this artificially high temperature because of stress hormones, and then after you eat, the temperature drops. That's probably indicative that you're running largely on stress hormones as a compensatory mechanism, right? So both types of things can show up, and that's where you'd want to fold in a person's symptoms to see what's going on. But ideally, what should happen is the numbers go up after eating.
Mm-hmm. Very, very well said there. One clarifying question. So you talked about measuring heart rate upon waking, and many people listening to this, myself included, will have a Whoop strap or an Oura ring or something like that, which measures your heart rate during sleep. And so, you mentioned you want to, being in the 60s upon waking. So can you talk about that just to drill down a little deeper in terms of during sleep versus upon waking, still lying down in bed versus being up and standing and walking around, just being quote unquote at rest, but still just generally moving about during your day, and how that may or may not affect some of these considerations.
Yeah, I would think that your heart rate might be slightly a little lower while you're sleeping. Probably not like an enormous difference, but I would imagine that would generally be the case, that it would be slower. I don't know of any research where they're running, not because it doesn't exist, I just haven't looked into it, where they're running temperature checks on people who are sleeping. So I can't really speak to that. I would imagine that it would probably be pretty similar. Again, so long as someone was well insulated and warmed while they were sleeping, and not doing some kind of strange biohack. But yeah, another thing too, just kind of on this subject, is it's also why I'm not a big proponent of cold exposure, is that most people already have some type of stressed physiology and/or are trying to bite off more than they can chew performance-wise. So your thyroid is in charge of thermoregulation largely and insulating the body. And so why would I want to make that already stressed gland, right? Why would I want to make that have to work even harder to heat myself?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So then perhaps once the thyroid improves and becomes more robust and effective, then you can start to introduce some of that if you wish. But in the beginning, for someone who has issues, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So we talked about a lot here in terms of just tying a few things together here with thyroid also. So is that some people have talked about, for example, feeling good on a ketogenic diet for a period of time, but then long term having issues come up. And so is that related to thyroid also for chronic depletion of carbs, or can you help us kind of just connect whatever dots we need to connect there for why many people have written about the experience of keto being beneficial for some period of time, but then after that, longer term, it's not as sustainable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things here. Let's talk about the obvious, and that's, a lot of these diets, whether it's plant-based or keto or whatever, they sometimes have this diet honeymoon phase. And the reason for that, at least in one sense, is probably acknowledging the power of placebo. If you think something is working or whatever, I think measured in lab, it's probably better than, I think it's 40% or more better than the control group, right? So there is that we have to acknowledge. Not to be, not to lead this off with kind of a woo-woo perspective, but, it's measured in, it has been objectively acknowledged in science. So there's that. The second thing is that a lot of people make, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of changes to their diet when they go keto or when they go plant-based or whatever, and they're ascribing it all to one thing. And so by that, I mean, a lot of people will go keto and then, they're increasing saturated fats. That's good. They are getting enough protein. That's a new thing. Maybe they're eating a better, more calories or less calories depending on the person, and that can be a good thing or a change or whatever. Maybe they're also starting to eat more clean organic foods, right? So usually there's more than one lever getting pulled there, and so they ascribe all those changes to, oh, it was the carbs, right? Or maybe their carb source before was so not great that when they start eliminating carbs, they're like, oh, it must have been the carbs, when really it's like there's a big difference in as far as the nutrients or inflammatory agents or lack thereof in something like a piece of fruit versus croissant, right? A gas station croissant or whatever, right? Doritos, in one thing you have, PUFAs or polyunsaturated fatty acids, seed oils, as some may know them. You have maybe some, processing ingredients, fillers, texturizers, things maybe not meant for human consumption. So you see where I'm going with this is like, instead of the like 20 other ingredients in the, the pastry, they just pull carbs as the only variable going on there that they've improved. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe if I switched and I was eating a better quality of carbs, I could have still felt better, but not had all those consequences. So I think that's another reason why people feel good early on, is they're pulling way more levers than they think and then oversimplifying it. I also think now, pivoting to the long-term part, I think that the more someone has PUFAs or polyunsaturated fatty acids stored in their body fat tissue, and there is research to support this, that they tend to almost have this detox-like effect when they do fasting or high protein, minimal fat diets for a little bit, because you already have so much energy stored on the body and you're using that, and you're maybe getting rid of some like non-ideal deposits in your fatty tissues, right? So there is probably something to that. And maybe that's right there is an advocacy, type of advocacy for certain people doing a diet like that for a very short period of time. And then I think long-term, what ends up happening, right, is something called adaptive thermogenesis, right? Your body is now out of an abundant state. It's having all these different inputs that it's maybe not dying is an extreme word, but let's just say dying. And so it wants to conserve resources. So we're going to spend a little less on giving you enough hormones, right, or testosterone or whatever it is. We're going to spend a little bit less on your immune system, and we're going to kind of tighten the budget belt a little bit energetically, and then that catches up to you over time. The other thing that catches up to you is like that initial artificial high of that you feel is probably stress hormones, right? Because of liberating your own fat for energy. So things like cortisol, glucagon, norepinephrine, things like that. You're sort of running off of these stress hormones, and that kind of gives you this sort of like, oh my God, I have so much energy, but it's sort of like fool's gold. And then eventually that'll catch up to you as your body compensates even further. And you're just sort of left feeling, in a more and more and more of a fatigued type state for a lot of people who don't, who are doing super low carbs and or, no sugar.
I think that's a great description. Let's drill down a little deeper, because you mentioned them there and then a couple other times in the past on PUFAs. So for people who don't know that acronym, it's polyunsaturated fatty acids as opposed to saturated or monounsaturated. So these are the hydrocarbon chain with more unbonded or unsaturated carbons. And these are, people have heard of the omega-3 and omega-6 fats. Those are the PUFAs here. So in our conversations, you shared with me an interesting paper on PUFAs, and it talked about how one of the quote unquote symptoms of deficiency in these fats is actually an increased metabolic rate. So they're saying that's a symptom. Based on our conversation today, a lot of people would probably see that as a benefit, right? We're trying to increase the metabolic rate, which is kind of funny. But can you talk to us just more specifically here? And we've touched on it. I just want to make sure we can connect the dots here. Talk to us about the effects, of course, on inflammation and energy production, and why these excess PUFAs can be problematic.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, just to try to, I can always cite sources offline, I guess, where it's like a little easier to be organized. But I believe the paper you're referring to is, why you don't want to be a fat burner. The researcher's name is Kyle Mamounis, Mamounis, if I'm saying it right. And then there's another one that health researcher Danny Roddy had put me onto it. I believe the guy's last name is Wolf. But it talks about how more fat burning preferentially is associated with a lot of these different disease states, right? So there's that. And then as far as why some of the polyunsaturated fatty acids can be problematic, or PUFAs, if you will, I don't think I don't want to make people into a hypochondriac here. I don't think there's anything wrong with your average healthy, robust person eating things like a high quality fatty fish here and there, like sushi, for example, is a hallmark for me. But I think it's the idea of either supplementing with additional ones, or some of the obviously unhealthy ones like canola oil, soy oil, stuff like that. Those behaviors you probably want to avoid. You talked about the inflammatory effect. That's certainly one aspect of the conversation. And then these things may also interrupt how our bodies produce energy in the electron transport chain. So anything that's going to interrupt my ability to produce energy is immediately, that's something antithetical to what we're trying to do, which is have a robust enough metabolism and energetic capacity to be healthy and then perform at a high clip too. And, like I mentioned, consulting with some of these teams, unfortunately, you'll go into some of these, institutions, universities, sports organizations. Even I used to work in the addiction detox field. The seed oils are like, their chefs are just preparing food with a ton of these seed oils in them. So it's really everywhere. But anyways, yeah, so there's that. And then, a lot of people will also cite lipid peroxidation, or the idea that these things are unstable at certain temperatures too. So there's probably more to the conversation there, but that's probably an easy way to put it, is inflammation, interrupting energetic processes, and potential, instability with heat causing issues there.
And one other thing that just to add on to what you mentioned there about inflammation, excuse me, and how some fatty fish can be okay, but these seed oils can be more problematic. Excuse me. So there's a difference. People look at their omega-3 and omega-6 ratio, and you want to, modern American diet is gonna give a higher, maybe 20 or 30 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, whereas an ideal ratio is more like 3 or 4 to 1 of omega-6 to omega-3. And the part of the reason that's important is that those two polyunsaturated fats compete for the same enzymes to be broken down, and the omega-6 ones lead to more pro-inflammatory cytokines when they're broken down, whereas the omega-3 ones are more anti-inflammatory. And so the ratio there matters a lot in terms of inflammation too. So that's just one thing. And so when we say seed oils, a big part of the reason that those are potentially problematic is that omega-6 ratio. So let's, unless you have anything else to say on that one as we wind down here, let's segue into talking a little bit more of the particulars. What are now some of your favorite foods, so we can sort of put a bow on this conversation with some more actionable items? Talking about all these concepts and principles, where does this lead us in terms of things that you like to recommend people actually eat?
Yeah, so I'll give like one overview sort of answer, and then I'll give some direct recommendations. So I'm not giving a total politician's answer, but in general, I kind of like this guy Ronnie Smith, who was he was a student of Dr. Ray Peat, and his company was known as Energy Concepts, and he has a framework for food selection that I like, and that's digestion, absorption, utilization. If you can digest something easily, then you can absorb its nutrients, and then you can better utilize them, right? So there's opposite ends, different ends of that spectrum. There's obviously this like stuff that wasn't meant for human consumption on one extreme end, and then things like junk foods, a lot of the industrial seed oils we just talked about, stuff like that, artificial sweeteners, stuff you want to minimize as much as you can. And then on the other side of that, there's stuff that's super easily digestible. That would be stuff like fruit juice, raw honey, meat, stuff that's fairly effortless to digest, and has a really good, if you want to think in economics, like has a really favorable ratio of energy supplied to energetic cost to absorb, right? Whereas there's also some things somewhere in the middle, maybe kind of trending towards the less ideal side. Certain vegetables, nuts, legumes and lentils, things like that, that sure, they might have some nutrients in there, but how hard does your body have to work to get those nutrients? And what other inflammatory agents and fibers or whatever anti-nutrients come along for the ride with that? And are the nutrients in there even going towards benefiting you, or are they like in there, or are they kind of combating another anti-nutrient in there? For example, the calcium counteracting oxalates in certain greens, right? Or the vitamin E counteracting PUFAs in nuts. Is there some sort of almost like inflation? Is there some sort of your dollar getting taxed 80 cents on the dollar effect there, where you're, what amount of energy does it take you to digest the thing versus are you even getting like very much energy out of it? So I think that's a really good way to think about food, is that, I think well-cooked kale here and there is probably fine. But I love macadamia nuts. I don't think they're particularly great for you, but having a little macadamia nuts here and there for me, I just like the taste, so I'm going to do it, right? But the bulk of my diet and the bulk of the diets that really anyone should eat is stuff that's going to be palatable. Usually the stuff that tastes the best actually is like, that's information that's telling us that it's good for us, A, and then B, foods that are easy to digest and have like a very robust amount of energy in there in the form of nutrients. And the foods you should generally avoid are the opposite of that. So I mentioned, most meats, not a big fan of like turkey or a ton of bacon, but like I think most, organ meat weekly and or oysters weekly is probably a good idea. I think the muscle meats are all great, your steak, stuff like that. That's all great. Game meat can be had too. Just make sure you're balancing it out with not only the organ meats, but also gelatin, bone broth, or collagen, so you get a more complete amino acid profile. Eggs are great. Dairy is great. It's one of those things where if it's in its raw, natural form, whether it's goat or raw milk, it should be fairly easy to digest, even if not quite as easy as meat and fruit. There's some room for debate there. But if you can't tolerate that, you can kind of almost rehab your gut to get there, right? Maybe a conversation for another day, or if you want me to unpack that, I can. Those are all good things. I think, getting, coffee is good quality coffee. Salting your food is a good idea. For the most part, if we're talking vegetables, things like either raw carrots, bamboo shoots, little white button mushrooms, things like that are good. Also, as a rule of thumb, the easier something is to digest vegetable wise, probably, the more likely it is to be okay for you. Certain potatoes, sweet potatoes come to mind for folks, stuff like that. Seaweed, for example. So just to give people some ideas, fruit juice, orange juice, probably being one that I'm most biased towards. It's hard to get enough calories or carbs if you're purely eating only fruits. So fruit juice, I'm a fan of if it's good quality. Orange juice, watermelon water is another one. Let's see here. Teeny bits of dark chocolate to undo stress physiology, I think is fine. Good quality dairy in the form of cheese, butter, stuff like that on top of the milk, I think is a good idea to have to get some bioavailable sources of calcium. Again, some people I consult with don't have that as a luxury for a starting point. So we might be doing like condensed milks, things like that, or even ground up eggshell calcium or a calcium carbonate supplement in order to, gradually, slowly but surely rehabilitate their gut. So that should hopefully give you some ammo as far as foods go. I do, shameless plug here, I do provide a grocery list in the book that you mentioned earlier, Adaptive Nutrition, which is available on my site. And then I also list out certain recommended supplements for people on my site as well.
Yes, and in the book, there's a great supplement list in the book, just so people can get another flavor of it. What are the top few levers to pull supplement wise? In addition to, of course, supplemental nutrients are in addition to the foods that you mentioned there, but what are some of your favorite supplements generally? Of course, you make more specific recommendations if you're consulting with someone, but
Sure.
what are some of those that, applying the 80-20 principle tend to have the most positive effects for the most number of people?
Yeah, so there's a lot of conditionally, if this, then that kind of stuff that can go on with supplements. But I definitely think for most people, vitamin D is probably a good idea. You can obviously do lab work, but vitamin D is probably a big one. I think vitamin K is another one. Um, I think aspirin is probably a good idea. Again, Danny had put me onto that one. Aspirin, because of it's not like the other problematic painkillers. It's got a nice systemic anti-inflammatory effect. So when I'm more stressed or I train that day, I'll usually do a little bit of aspirin way later at the end of the day. If I'm feeling a little run down, you got to make sure you're on vitamin K for that, since it is you're going to utilize more of it. Um, those are some of the main ones. I think vitamin E is really important in this modern environment, especially if you're going to need to eat out at all. Vitamin E is another one. I think some people, depending on their metabolic starting point, vitamin A could play a role. Um, those are some. If you cross into other things, I think most people are likely to be deficient in that are tough to capture through whole food. I think magnesium supplementation is a good idea. Uh, I tend to think glycinate is the best. I think carbonate is solid, potentially orotate. I know a lot of them have different functions, but glycinate tends to be the one that I settle on the most. Um, I can, like I said, at the end, I'll share links to where people can look at my expanded thoughts on there. I also think that for a lot of people, this is a pharmaceutical, but it's actually closer to being a supplement. I think an ultra low dose uh, experiment in thyroid supplementation could be a good idea too. If it is a bioidentical thyroid hormone like T3 or T3 and T4, uh, although they get misprescribed as far as dosing and all that by most allopathic doctors, uh, that's actually something more supplemental in the sense we used to get it through our diet, right? Our meat actually used to have the thyroid gland in it. And before that, we probably ate nose to tail, right? So you're really just, if you're dosing it properly, you're really just shoring up biological weak points. Um, Dr. Broda Barnes talked a lot about that, as have others. So conditionally essential, but I've found most people tend to do well with it. Other things like, again, different answers maybe depending on what clientele I'm dealing with, but a lot of my athletes, if it's okay for their athletic body, certain things like pregnenolone, DHEA, progesterone at appropriate doses can be useful to combat system loss from the modern stressful environment. What else? Some people do well with ultra low dose methylene blue, which again is kind of more in the pharmaceutical realm, but it actually, in terms of benefits and side effects, is much more kind of wellness and preventative based. It's not like your average pharmaceutical. If someone has trouble or has a lot of system loss of calcium and getting it through dietary sources, we'll do calcium carbonate. Those are the main ones. I'm sure I missed some, but if people want to check out more, again, they can adaptive nutrition at my website, which is rewireperformance.com. And then also, I recently launched a supplement dispensary, and instead of pumping one brand like people do, it's a dispensary where it's kind of my thoughts on the best relevant ones in each category, because it's kind of just how it is. Some companies will do product A, B, and C really well, but not, we might have different belief systems in our framework. So I might not agree with, X, Y, and Z that they do. So people will be able to go on there, take a look at supplements, and then also order their own labs pretty soon too. And that's halflifenutrition.com.
Awesome. Yes, I've been.
If
on
that's
there.
too complex, then there's Amazon links on rewireperformance.com.
Yeah, well, it's a good site. I've seen the different products that you recommend on there, and I remember, like there were some Thorne products on there, and a few others that are, very good, high quality. And I like how you've curated, the best from different companies out there. So it was good. Your list, a lot of the stuff I have taken or agree can be valuable. The two that jump out at me that I haven't really ever considered taking aspirin. That was an interesting one that stuck out at me. I'm in part So in part because, I guess I mentally had sort of combined it in with the ibuprofen, acetaminophen,
Yeah.
and some of the other non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So I'd be curious to learn more. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole right now as we wind down this conversation, but that's one. And then actually taking the thyroid hormone. I know a lot of people do, and I know a lot of people have sworn by it, but that's the one I've never actually looked at. But we'll just learn more about in the aftermath of this conversation. So it stimulated a lot of thought within me, hopefully also within everyone else listening to this. You mentioned your Rewire Performance website, Half-Life Nutrition website. So book Adaptive Nutrition, I highly recommend. I read it, in an evening, really got into it and just really enjoyed it. It's an ebook format, so you're continuously updating and people get access to those, right?
Yeah. So depending on how things go, I might actually update the ebook and then send everyone who bought one updated copies because it goes and you release something. It's like there could have been more in there, more context, or your ideas perpetually kind of expand. So I might do little mini ebooks on certain topics, like for example, nutrition for rehabilitation specifically, talking about the energy structure function model. Give Aaron Davis some credit there for that nomenclature, but stuff like that, or I may add it to the book. But yeah, I mean, if there are any updates to the book and you buy it, I'll definitely send it to you. Yeah.
Awesome. So we got the two website URLs, and then I know you're active, and we interact on Instagram. So let everyone know your Instagram handle.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and against my better judgment, TikTok as at Rewire HP. So feel free to go see my propaganda there if you were so inclined.
I would encourage people to go and check it out. He's got some very, very good, informative, educational content on there. I always enjoy it when I see it in my feed, and appreciate the work that you're doing, sharing that information, putting out this book. I know the work that went into that, and coming on the podcast and sharing it with everybody. It's just great to dive in here. I really appreciate you coming on, Coop.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always appreciate coming on, and I'm sure we'll do it again sometime. So hopefully people feel like they learned some things, and ultimately, I'm certainly not the end point of this conversation. So I'm sure my views will change in the future. So hopefully things kind of just give you an idea of how to think for yourselves, and then health is a journey, right? Just like life. So hopefully it helped you along your own.
Yeah, that's a great note on which to end, because this conversation, encapsulates one of the ways in which my own views and then of course habits and strategies have evolved just in the last year or two. So it's good, and you've been a part of that. So thank you, Coop, and NeuFit Nation. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode of the Undercurrent podcast.